To cut the appropriate pieces of muslin, the appropriate size, I need to measure the length of the front and back sloper plus the width. The length will go parallel to the selvage of the fabric. So I'm going to roll my muslin out and cut the length measuring. Always tear because then it's right on grain. Snip and tear. The best muslin is a tightly woven muslin, not a gauzy muslin. Now, I want to tear the selvages off because they bind the fabric. They keep it from blocking correctly. But before I tear the selvages off, I'm going to mark with arrows the length grain, which is also called the warp, W-A-R-P, and it's parallel to the selvage. This way, as I work with the muslin, I will not forget which is the cross grain, which is the length grain. The cross grain is called the weft, W-E-F-T. It has a little bit more stretch than the length grain. Now I'm just comparing to make sure I've cut the right amount, which clearly I have. If I tear it in half, lengthwise, I'll have one piece for the front and one piece for the back. When you tear fabric, cotton anyway, the edges kind of roll under. So I want to press this so it's nice and flat. And then I'm going to show you how to block the fabric. Fabric is woven with the weft and warp threads perpendicular to each other. But often when it's put on a roll, it warps and becomes distorted. So we want to do what is called blocking the fabric to bring it back into shape. As you see, I'm twisting the fabric around and around. If I hadn't marked the length grain, I might be a little bit confused. I could figure it out, but it's easier to have the mark. Now, I've folded the sides and I notice one side is shorter. That means it's warped. I made a little mark so as to remember which one that is, and I'm going to take the diagonal opposite corner and stretch the fabric. I'm going to pull this back into shape, so that when it's folded in half lengthwise and widthwise, all of the corners are meet and they're perpendicular. It kind of bows up, but I can take care of that. I'm going to pin the edges together and steam it. This will help block it back into shape. Although I'm using a more professional iron, a good home iron with steam is a fine tool to use. I'm not going over the pins because I don't want to scratch the surface of the iron. And I'm not going to create a crease. Open your fabric and pin the opposite, or fold it the opposite direction. And again, you see there's a short edge. So I'm going to take that short edge and stretch diagonally across, up and down the fabric in the direction of the short corner. Pull it back together and check again. Now you can see it's blocked. All of the corners are back in shape. There you go. You'll do this with both pieces. Starting with the center front piece. Just like I did on the paper pattern, I want to establish a bust, waist, and hip line. I'm measuring from the top of the muslin to the bust line. Since the fabric was blocked, I can do this, and when I connect it, it should be perpendicular to the perpendicular to the sides of the fabric. From the bust to the waist, and from the waist to the hips. Now what I'm doing is folding the fabric in half. I want to create a center front seam or line. And filling that line in, or the crease in, with red pencil or a very fine tip felt pen. Center front. Folding the fabric again and pen through the line, matching the line on the other side at the bust, waist, and hips. Just to stabilize the fabric while I work, I'll put a few more pins in it. Lay your pattern, matching the center front line and the bust, waist, and hips. Make sure that your pins are out of the way of cutting, because if you try to cut through a pin, you'll ruin the blade of your scissors. You see how easy this is? Snip your notches. Center front is on the fold. I apparently had not marked the length grain on that piece. This has been blocked, but it needs a little bit more pressing. Because it's on top of paper, I'm not giving it steam. Just creating a fold line. Now I want to create a center back seam. And when I fit a muslin torso sloper or any sloper, I usually put a full 1 inch down center back. Just gives you a lot to manipulate if you need to make changes. The same on the other side. After I've traced off the pattern, I'll slash up that fold, and then I'll have a left and a right back. The torso sloper will be pinned up the center back. Right now I am only establishing the hip, waist, bust, and horizontal balance point on the center back. Again, because the fabric has been blocked, I can measure from the top of the muslin down to my markings and draw a straight line. And I know they will be perpendicular to the center back. To transfer these lines to the other side, put a pen straight through in a couple of places on each line. See how easy it is to trace the lines on the back? Now I've placed the exact center back line on the red line that I drew on the muslin so that there will be a 1-inch extension from the center back line of the sloper to the edge of the fabric. I'm simply filling in where the horizontal balance line is. I'd like to put a perpendicular line at the bottom of darts and possibly a little circle so that when I'm working with the pattern, my eye goes to those areas quickly without having to search. I find that the red really brings attention and just makes it easier to see things. Filling in the horizontal balance line. And transferring it to the other side. HBL, horizontal balance line, bust, waist, hip. Cut the two sides apart. Center back, arrow showing exactly where center back line is, and fill in the seam allowance. 1 inch SA seam allowance. Now, with putting the muslin on top of the pattern, I can see through the muslin to the dart, the two darts actually, and I can simply trace them by seeing through the muslin. Yeah. And then I'm writing the intake 3/4 of an inch on either side. So that's 1.5 inches total for this particular model. I'm penciling in the seam allowance down the side seams. This way, when I sew it together, I can be absolutely sure that I'm sewing on the correct line so that I will know if the sloper is the correct size. So fill in the shoulder seam lines and the shoulder dart. I put a cross mark at the bottom of the dart just to be sure I know where that dart stops. I'm dotting in the seam allowance around the neckline. And the armhole. This way, when I sew it and turn under the seam allowances around the armhole, I'm sure that I'm being very accurate. Now to mark the other side of the fabric, what I'm doing is putting the fabrics together, matching everything up very, very carefully, and I'm going to take a straight pin and stab it straight through that cross grain. I'm also putting it right on the 1 inch center back seam allowance. Marking with pins through both layers of the fabric at the cross grain at the waist. And at the hemline. And just to secure the rest of it down, put a few pins in it. I'm putting pins straight through the tips of the darts, the center of the fisheye waist dart, and at the extreme sides of the two dart legs and the bottom of the dart. You want those pins to go straight down, otherwise they won't be incredibly accurate. Flip it over, and now you have some guidelines to fill in the markings. You can see I'm aligning the ruler with the tip of the dart and filling in the legs. 1/4, 1/4, it's 1/2 inch total. The middle line for the fisheye dart. And then, of course, the outer lines that you sew together. This is a real easy and fast way to transfer markings. Now remember the curve, if you start the curve at the same number on left and right pieces, then the curves are exactly the same. So I started this particular curve with 15 resting on the waistline, filling in the amounts 3/4 and 3/4. And then again, just so that when I sew it, I'm sure I was accurate at the end, I'm filling in all the seam allowances. Writing hemline on the hemline. Filling in the armhole seam allowance, the shoulder seam allowance. Basically everything I did on one side, I repeat on the other side. You don't really have to make all of these markings. If you want to work with less markings, it's fine. But this is a good way to teach you to go over it and over it. And I like a lot of information on my patterns and on my muslins. That way there's no second guessing when I go to work with it. Putting in a red grain line parallel to center back. Well, actually, that's the seam allowance, but it's also a grain line. I like to mark my grain lines with red when I remember to do so. You may have noticed that the center back line on the paper is not the same seam allowance, doesn't have the same seam allowance as the muslin. That's fine. I took the seam allowance of the muslin and expanded it to be 1 inch. I'm snipping the notches just a little bit so that when I go to sew this, I have these little tiny markings or snips in the fabric. Now I'm aligning the pattern under the right side of the fabric. I can see through this muslin. This is just a different way to go about marking. So you'll learn 2 methods. Middle line for the fisheye dart. Both sides at the waist are marked, and then align them with the middle line, and you create your dart. Again, flipping the ruler so that the correct number, or the number I choose at the waist, is the same on both sides to create the same exact curve on left and right. Making the shoulder dart. Drawing in the seam allowance at the shoulders, marking the neckline, the side seam, be sure to put your model's name on it so you don't get them confused. It's very easy to confuse these muslins if they are similar in shape and size. Filling in the seam allowances. And then just like I did the back pieces, pinning together to transfer the markings from one side to the other side, starting with the cross grains. Filling in the darts. Shoulder dart. And seam allowances. Hem allowance. And now our front muslin sloper is completed, and so is the back. Now to sew them together or pin them together and try them on the model. The upper line was the horizontal balance line, bust line, waistline, and of course the hip line and hemline. And here we have our muslin sloper to put together.